Welcome back to another episode of the Dynamics Compass podcast, where we bring in the experts so you don't have to figure it all out the hard way. Today, we've got a guest with a career journey that's anything but typical. Chris Warren started out as an electrical engineer, but instead of just wiring up circuits, he ended up picking and plugging ERP systems. Now, as the IT director at ivWatch, he's leading the charge in a highly regulated medical device environment, managing Business Central with the kind of precision you'd expect from an engineer. And with over 7 years of deep expertise in Dynamics NAV and Business Central, plus chairing the BC NAVOC Board of Advisors, Chris has successfully pulled off major upgrades faster than most companies even planned them. Now, previously, we've gained great insights from Microsoft partners about the transition from Navision, but today I'm particularly keen to learn from the customer's perspective. So I'm very grateful that you decided to come on the show, Chris. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's break the ice first a little bit. Could you share something that not a lot of people know about you?
Sure. So when my wife and I moved back to Virginia once we graduated from college, we had to go through and update all of our vehicle registrations. And on our drive up here, she saw this Virginia license plate that had a blue crab on it. And she said she had to have it for one of her cars. And I said, sure, that's fine. And asked, what did she want on it? And she said she didn't really care. It was up to me. So I actually wrote nav slash Business Central on that license plate. And when she came in the mail, she was livid because now she has to drive around a car that has Business Central written across the back of it. So needless to say, I will never get that option again to choose a license plate for one of our vehicles.
But a forever advocate for the products.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. All right, let's dive in. This
Sure.
is so the whole premise indeed of the podcast is that to help people that have questions about the Dynamics environment or the journey that they haven't been on yet. You were on Navision. Um, what were your reasons to move to Business Central?
Yeah, so when I inherited our nav environment, we were on nav 2017. This is probably back in I think I'd say like 2019, 2020-ish. And this was right around the time where Microsoft was releasing the end of support for, the different versions of nav.
Hmm.
And being the director of IT and knowing that I had a legacy system that I was in charge of, that I had to support, I had to make sure was secure, and that I was hosting on-prem, that really made me nervous. And so, before I even got into this role, I didn't really know a whole lot about ERP systems. And so when we had some staff turnover, I was lucky enough to inherit our nav environment. So, I got to hear about all the different pain points for departments about, how, they wanted to use the system, how, the system's limitations, how, maybe business processes didn't work. And,
Hmm.
we wanted to deploy some add-ons. So if you're running a legacy system like Nav, a lot of the major add-ons that are on the market today are not supported,
Yeah.
or you're paying more for a legacy version of the software, which might not have the security updates or anything like that you would expect to have when you're spending 20, 30 thousand dollars or more on one of these add-ins. So I after spending all that time with those departments, I really wanted to make sure that we could make these efficiency changes, but once I was getting quotes back and telling these vendors that, we wanted to upgrade to Business Central pretty soon, pretty much every single person came back to me and said, just wait till you get to Business Central because it'll be a huge cost savings for you. So that way you're not essentially having to pay for, two different deployments of the same software. And
So that sped up things for you.
it really did. And so that's really what put a fire underneath, my company at the time was just to make sure that, for us to make some operational efficiency changes, we needed to go ahead and upgrade before we could start taking, steps in the right direction to deploy them. And part of that too is, the huge code change between Nav and Business Central. So, the base code language changed. And so that was the reason that you essentially had to deploy the products twice.
Yeah.
If you did it both in Nav and in Business Central.
Yeah. And um, I know for a lot of companies there's still discussions. There's a lot of
Mhm.
arguments to move to Business Central. But for you, were there any reasons to stay on Nav?
I think probably the biggest argument I got from my management team at the time was that it was just easier to stay on Nav.
Mhm.
We didn't really have a whole lot of expertise in the system at the time. There were a lot of unknowns. It really wasn't configured properly. So jumping from one software version, all the way up to the next was a huge leap for us because going from Nav, 2017, we were at that point, you're way behind because it went Nav 2017, Nav 2018 to BC 14, all the way up, and we were jumping to BC 20 at the time.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that conversation with our CFO at the time. And she just said, no, she said, let's just stay on Nav. And we'll figure it out. We'll make Nav perfect before we can upgrade. And as anyone who manages business software systems knows, you're never going to make the system be, foolproof and perfect. So
Mhm.
you really just kind of have to understand what your system is doing. And, just because it's easier to stay, on your current software version
Yeah.
doesn't really mean that's the best thing to do for the business. Now that we've done the NAV 2017 to BC 20, 21, 22, 23, and now working on the SaaS transitions, as we've done this, because we have stayed current, our upgrades are just so much easier. When you're jumping, 20 software versions, it makes things a lot more difficult. There's a lot more testing. So,
Yeah.
just like I said before, just because it's easy to stay on your current system, your legacy system, doesn't really mean that's the best thing to do.
Yeah. You just made a comment, and I just wanna give the make sure that the audience also gets that context. You said we're now looking to move to the SaaS
Mhm.
products. You're still on-prem, right?
Yeah,
Wh-
yeah, that's a good point. We are on-prem, so everything that I'm talking about from my current experience is just from us maintaining our on-prem version. So that means maintaining our Windows servers. That means maintaining our SQL servers all the way to the application servers for these products. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be about on-prem, but it does still apply to the SaaS version as well.
Yes. What's then your reasons to move to the cloud? Like I know there's a lot of reasons, but what are your particular reasons?
Yeah, for me, the way I was able to present this to our management team was just the huge cost savings going back to add-ons. So, we have a lot of ideas for how we would like to improve Business Central moving forward because we're heavy in the e-commerce space. We have global customers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of projects that we would like to do. But anything on-prem with regards to software licensing and deployment costs essentially starts off at $20,000 easy. And so, the nice thing about going to the online version is you finally gain access to Microsoft's App Source. So if you want to, try out some new add-on that's out there, you have the ability to quickly spin up a sandbox. You
Yeah.
can install that plugin and you can see how it functions. You can test it out and you can pretty much manage all that yourself. You don't have to worry about going to your partner saying, "Hey, I need you to, go ahead and to pull these objects into our system, make sure that it works." And it's a lot more legwork for you to
Hmm.
do things like that.
Yeah.
But, essentially once you move to SaaS, you really only have to worry about application costs. Just the licensing. You don't have to really worry about the whole deployment structure that you see on-prem.
Yeah. So you're making yourself a lot more agile and ready for
Yeah,
growth.
yeah, absolutely. And the other big thing too is for all the non-technical people out there, I don't know how you guys feel about VPNs. Um, but having remote users and trying to explain to them how a VPN works and they have to turn it on before they access Business Central has always been a headache. So not having to worry about that infrastructure on-prem too
Yeah.
is really a huge time saver for all of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, I bet. So talking about then from the moment that you moved from NAV to BC, did
Mhm.
the implementation go as planned?
Yeah, so you know, the implementation was a lot of legwork at the very, very beginning because once we finally got the go ahead to make sure or to allow me to pursue upgrading NAV to Business Central, because we work in such a highly regulated environment, there's a lot of standards that the FDA has put out around electronic software systems and validations and things like that I have to make sure that I abide by whenever we make changes to such a crucial piece of software within this industry,
Yeah.
which, originally I thought that was kind of a hindrance for us. But actually, because of those regulations and the work that we did prior, everything did go as planned. And like some other people have heard me say this before, I'll never forget that time we went live on that Monday morning when we went from Nav to Business Central because I walked in, I had worked all weekend, Friday night, Saturday, all day Sunday, went to the office, updated all the URLs across all of our manufacturing machines, made sure everything was working as planned. And on that Monday, when I was sitting at my desk, I got there early around 6 a.m. People didn't show up till around 9. No one said a word to me. And it was the oddest feeling because, we had just done this major upgrade. And, around lunchtime, I started walking around the office just trying to, ask people how things were going, how they liked Business Central. And everybody just pretended like everything was fine. And it was. And so, nobody realized how much work went into this for the 6 months beforehand.
Yeah. So
So, like,
they weren't pretending.
no, 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 they weren't pretending, really. I mean, it was just everything was fine. Everything worked. So, I mean, all the legwork to get up to that deployment was worth it. Um, but yeah, it was definitely an experience to go through such a transformation like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. What was the hardest part about it?
Yeah, there were a few challenges. So we were using the role tailored client for Nav, which officially went out, I want to say in either 2017 or 2018, and that is all our users were used to using. So
Okay.
going from Nav to Business Central, you have to then move to the web client, which is a totally different, graphical user interface than what the desktop client used to be.
Yeah.
And so, I had to force every department to sit in a room with me for 1 to 2 hours a week at least before we went live, just to show them how it worked, make sure that they were adequately trained, make sure they knew how to do their job. Because, management was very skeptical at the time of us making such a large jump from, NAV 2017 all the way up to Business Central 20
Yeah.
and just maybe confusing people, disrupting day-to-day operations with a new software system and things like that. But I think training was difficult. There was some user adoption, where people didn't really necessarily want to make the change, in departments. But
Yeah.
I think that was probably one of the biggest pain points. And then I think the other two was just generating that test plan that I've talked about before is, I had spent so much time with all these different departments. I knew all the documentation and paperwork that, had to go into validating the system once we did the upgrade.
Hmm.
And so I ended up having to go through and document every single mouse click essentially on how we needed to test the system and show that, those tests actually passed, once the system was ready for go live. And
Yeah.
so between the training and all the documentation, I think that was probably one of the hardest parts that I kind of overlooked at the beginning. I didn't think it would be that hard because, sure, it's software. You can just click install or upgrade and it should work, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so no, I mean one of the hardest parts was definitely just making the time to go through and doing the training and all the documentation.
Yeah. It sounds like you're someone who's very meticulous, which I think would probably have contributed to the success of this implementation.
Yeah, we definitely have to be very meticulous and very detail oriented when going through something like this.
Yeah.
Because we are such a small company, I had to play the role of both project manager and the technical resource at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm not one to really ask for help that often. I always like to go out and research it and try to figure out the solutions myself. So
Yeah.
just trying to play both those roles was interesting.
Yeah. I bet. So, from your experience then, um, what what would you say are the critical factors to a BC implementation?
Yes, to me, the most critical factors of making sure that you have a successful either implementation, re-implementation, or upgrade is really getting the buy-in from all of your users before you actually start this process.
Yeah.
So as I was going through and helping each of these different departments, making sure they, figuring out how they use the system and things like that, whenever they would say, "Hey, this is a pain point for me," I would always say, "Well, in Business Central, there's this new feature that actually would, alleviate that for you."
Hmm.
So I made sure that I was getting the staff excited about this upgrade before it was even going to happen,
Yeah.
just so that way there would be less resistance when it finally went live. So, making sure that your staff is excited about it, but also getting an upgrade team. So you need to find the key users in every single department that utilize Business Central that understand how their department uses it,
Yeah.
and they need to be a part of your test team. So as I was writing this document, for our upgrade plan to talk about, how what we needed to test and things like that, I would actually run it by each of the key players in every department to make sure it covered all of the different aspects of the system that they used. And so when it came time for go live, what I would do is I would just, separate out each of the different test plan sections to the different departments. And I'd say, hey, run through this for me. Just verify that every test step passes. And if it's good, then, we can move forward with the go live this weekend.
Yeah.
So making sure that you have that upgrade team and a good test plan too. That is the key thing that you need in order to be able to pull off a successful upgrade. And there's no way around that.
Yeah. And can I just clarify, did you do it all by yourself? Did you engage a partner in the process?
Yeah, so our partner did have their own test plans that they would run through internally,
Hmm.
but from when I've talked to other people out there, it really is up to the end user in order to make sure that you test the system before your go live.
Yeah.
Because your partner's not really going to know your business processes. They're not going to know how you utilize the system. Sure, they'll make sure that, everything is functioning out of the box as it should, but whether you have customizations or you have, specific add-ons or things like that, they might not be able to test everything for you. So
Yeah.
that was one of the things that was also critical was making sure that we had a resource internally, which was myself to go through and write that test plan to make sure that, after our partner tested it before we were handed our system,
Hmm.
then we could then run through it ourselves with our own tests to make sure that there weren't going to be any major issues that prevented, payroll on day one or things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. So for the ones that are still like, is it worth it? What benefits or ROI have you seen?
Yeah, so that's definitely a great question. So, like I mentioned before, when we were on Nav, we really wanted to be able to deploy some add-ons where it was just not financially responsible for us to deploy them, knowing we were going to upgrade from Nav to Business Central so soon.
Yeah.
But once we upgraded, we were able to deploy, for example, shop floor from InsightWorks. And, we used to have 2 to 3 different people that their entire job was essentially just reconciling time cards against production orders.
Yeah.
But now that we were upgraded and we weren't going to have to pay, double implementation costs or, pay for the transformation from NAV to BC for the same add-on, we were able to deploy some newer softwares like Shopfloor, and we didn't need to have manual labor to go through and do this reconciliation because it was all automated.
Yeah.
This system worked out very well. And it was the same thing with, for example, Continuous Expense Management. That's another software that we heavily use every single day. We used to use a non-integrated expense management system within Business Central, and it was we had five different approvers that were running between the first floor and third floor of our building to
Yeah.
hand a paper off for managers to sign, and it just didn't really work. It wasn't efficient. But because now we were on, an updated system, we were current and we've been staying current, we're able to deploy these things and it saved us a lot of money, as well as the new reporting features within BC as well. You'll see that, with each release wave, there's
Yeah.
always new Power BI reports that are coming out. And we've really been able to save on a lot of costs just from utilizing these new out of the box features, which we would have never gotten if we had decided to stay on Nav, or even if we hadn't decided to move from Business Central versions twice a year.
Yeah.
So it's definitely is a huge cost savings for a business to make sure that they are current and that they stay current. Leaving as your business changes, you really have to make sure that your ERP system is evolving with you. It's not something that you can just leave stagnant.
Yeah. I agree. So not only the out of the box features like the reporting that you mentioned, but moving to BC, the benefit has been the access that you have to all these add-ons, the ISVs that now add extra value to you.
Yeah.
Um, okay, but that's
But I mean, there's still more out of the box features. One of the other things too is just the efficiencies for us to be able to migrate our workflows from the native, workflow feature that's in BC to Power Automate, for example. This is something that's relatively new to Business Central within the last few versions, but at this point now, for example, all of our approvals just get sent to people through Teams. And it's so easy for people to see purchase orders or sales orders and be able to just click approve,
yeah,
through the card through the Teams chat versus having to make sure they connect to the VPN, make sure they have the right Business Central URL, make sure they know which purchase order needs to be approved.
yeah,
We don't have to deal with any of that anymore. So just the time savings alone has made all these upgrades worth it.
yeah. Do you guys use Copilot at all?
We do not at this time. So Copilot is only available for the SaaS version.
Yeah,
So
I was gonna
we're
ask that.
still, yeah, so we're still working towards that. I think the business knowledge that we will get out of Copilot will be very beneficial.
Mhm.
But at this time, most people aren't using it.
Okay, all right. Um, Looking back, it sounds like you had a very successful implementation of BC.
Oh yeah.
Especially with no one knocking on your door on the first day and that everyone was silent. But
Yep.
in, is there anything you would have done differently?
I think allowing myself more time for the deployment would have been beneficial. I definitely underestimated all the time that it was going to take to make sure that, we had all the right infrastructure in place to make sure that, I knew how long that test plan was going to take me to create.
Hmm.
It's when you're on-prem, there's just so many more aspects that you really have to think about. We ended up having to buy a whole new server just to host, Windows Server 2019 because we were on 2012 R2. So
Hmm.
that was an extra cost. Our SQL server also needed to be updated. So that was another licensing cost that we had to pay for.
Yeah,
You also
yeah,
have to think about all your CALs and things like that. So, at first I thought, like I mentioned before, it was going to just be very easy to click, update or upgrade and we can call it a day. But, I think just allowing myself more time, would have been very beneficial.
yeah. I wasn't going to ask you this question, but you just said something that prompted me to do that. For you, was this an upgrade or a re-implementation?
Ooh, that's funny because we had that conversation before we went through this upgrade. So for us, technically, it was an upgrade. However, our previous partner, not the one that we're currently with, but the one who did the original implementation, had recommended so many customizations and things that we had over 100,000 lines of custom code in our system that that weren't being called upon, that weren't being used. They were
Yeah.
just there taking up space. So we did have that conversation on, is it better just to do a re-implementation of Business Central from the ground up,
Hmm.
or should we upgrade our nav system? And so what we ended up doing was when we did the upgrade from nav to Business Central, we didn't migrate over from the old code to the new code anything that wasn't used.
Okay. Yeah.
So sure, technically it was an upgrade, but at the same time, it kind of was a little bit of a re-implementation because, you know, we removed a lot of things from the system that we didn't need anymore.
Yeah. Did the way of working change a lot for your end users?
No, from the front end, you couldn't tell a difference. All this stuff was just code on the back ends that our previous partner thought we needed. Just all these extra customizations, and unfortunately, that code just was never used. And so we ended up just ripping it out of the system. And I always like to run software systems as they are out of the box. I think customizations can oftentimes be very costly and
Yeah.
detrimental to a company if you don't really understand why you're doing these customizations.
Yeah.
So what we did was we just went back to the basics. We reverted all those customizations, took them out of the system. They're not in our BC environment anymore. And now we are just running the base version of Business Central. And going back to those customizations, though, we do have some. We just have a few extra fields
Yeah.
and a few unique code units that were deployed. But we have a running list. We have a document. Anytime that we have to make a change to the base system,
Yeah.
I add it to this document just so that way I know how our version of Business Central is different from the base version. So
Yeah.
this way, I can always make sure that those, tests, are fun, or those customizations are working properly when we do our tests from, version to version upgrade.
Yeah. Okay. So, and apart from the customizations, from you have previously being on nav to then go to BC, the end
Yep.
users didn't have to change their way of working. Business processes didn't have to change at all.
So we did do a lot of optimizations for business processes when we
Okay.
did go from Nav to Business Central, but that was just a choice internally, just to have a clean cut over
Yeah.
from Nav to Business Central. As people are making these or learning how to use this new system, just to make sure that let's go ahead and just bite the bullet and make sure that we make those process changes at the same time.
Yeah.
So that way, it's just kind of one learning curve as opposed to making changes every single week, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
So I know that can get very tricky for end users when we do that.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Lastly, what tip would you give other customers that are planning their BC implementation or upgrade?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I really think it boils down to three things. Make your company excited about these new features. A lot of people in the industry, they get nervous when you start talking about making change. But for, I'd say, the year leading up to our first upgrade, I would say, Nav can't do that, but once we migrate to Business Central, you don't have to worry about that anymore. And I think people got tired of me saying that so frequently.
Yeah.
So I did. I got the entire company very excited about making this change, going through this upgrade process. So first, get your company excited. The other is making sure that you have an upgrade team internally.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have the same people performing those tests every single time that you do an upgrade or an implementation, there is, it gets hard to train someone new every time you do that. But when
Yeah.
you have, a core group of people that are just dedicated to running through that test plan that you create, we can knock this out now in like 2 or 3 hours,
Oh,
which
well.
is kind of unheard of for a company to do these major upgrades twice a year and just to knock them out in a few hours.
Yeah.
So, once that system's ready and we go through that test plan, just because we have the same people doing it, it makes it very easy.
Yeah.
And then finally, I would say make sure you get current on your Nav or Business Central environment and stay current too, because jumping major versions gets to be very, very difficult when you have to go through that process. So going from, now 2017 to Business Central 20, there was such a huge gap there. There was a lot more legwork that we had to do
Hmm.
to make sure that this was a successful implementation,
Yeah.
or upgrade. And now that we are current and we have been staying current, this is essentially a non-event for a company. I do these twice a year, going from major version to major version, and we have no issues. And, I think it really just comes down to the fact that, now that we're just doing these, I mean, they're called major upgrades, but to us, they're pretty minor. It just makes the whole thing so much easier.
Yeah.
And at this point, our management team doesn't really mind that we do these upgrades just because they don't have to worry about, data loss or, business operations being impacted or anything like that. It all just, they know it works. We have a tried and true system, so it's not really an issue for us anymore. So definitely make sure that once you are current, don't think that you can wait another 10 years to do another major upgrade. Just stay
Yeah.
current. Microsoft's making it so easy for you to do that now. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Thanks.
those would definitely be my top three recommendations for everybody that's, either gonna re-implement, move to BC, or do a major upgrade.
Yeah. No, thanks. Thanks for sharing. I think they're very insightful. For anyone that wants to walk up to you, are you going to be speaking at any of the events this year?
I am. So I've been speaking at Summit since I want to say 2020-ish.
Yeah.
That was my second year at Summit, and I make sure I always give talks on upgrading, our journey at ivWatch of what it took to get to where we are now.
Hmm.
I'll actually be at the Dynamics Communities Roadshow in DC here in mid-April. I think it's April 16th.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, I mean, Summit's gonna be the next one I'm speaking at, but yeah, you'll see me all the time on the Dynamics Communities forums. You'll see me on all of our webinars or national user group meetings that we have once per month.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Sweet. So anyone that has questions for Chris, you can easily find
yeah,
him.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks so much for all the insights, Chris. I think it was very valuable to hear the perspective of an end user for a change. Both
Yeah,
sides are very important, but you're the first one to represent the customer. So thanks for doing that today.
yeah, Rory, thank you so much for this opportunity. So I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. You have a great rest of your day.
All right, thanks, you
Bye.
too.
Thanks for watching this episode on the Dynamics Compass podcast. We decided to launch this podcast after having spoken to a lot of people in the community who seem to be looking for answers to the same questions. So then we decided, why don't we find experts in the market that have the answers, interview them, and then release that information for free to help everyone progress their Microsoft Dynamics journey. So we hope that you found this video very informative and helpful for you to continue your journey and keep moving forward. If you would like to hear about any other topics, please write to me on LinkedIn, email me, Rory at thegoodtalent.co, and we'd be happy to have a look. We'll look for the experts that have the answers. We'll interview them and it will be freely available to you. Again, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for your support as well. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.